Mark Thompson never thought his retirement would come with court dates. He had spent 40 years arguing cases in packed courtrooms. But now, finally, he just wanted peace. After decades of chaos and stress, his dream was simple: a quiet suburban home, a little garden to tend, and maybe a few afternoons spent reading on the porch. He found that home in Willow Creek, a neat little neighborhood in the suburbs of Ohio. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and an HOA that promised to keep everything nice and orderly. Mark liked the sound of that. He figured HOA meant no loud parties, no cars parked on the lawn, and no weird neighbors. Perfect at first. Everything was just as peaceful as he'd hoped. But then, Karen showed up. Now Karen wasn't just any HOA president. No, Karen was the kind of person who made a hobby out of enforcing rules no one even knew existed. She had a clipboard, a walkie-talkie, and eyes sharper than a hawk. The kind of woman who could find fault in a freshly trimmed lawn, or a mailbox that was just slightly the wrong shade of white dot and her first target. Mark's garden, gnome. Yes, that's right, a little ceramic gnome, about 2 feet tall, standing proudly beside Mark's front flower bed, wearing a bright red hat and holding a tiny lantern. Not to most people, it was just a charming decoration, a quirky touch that gave the house a bit of personality, but to Karen, it was a violation. The HOA rules were murky on the topic of lawn ornaments. The handbook mentioned no unauthorized decorations but never defined what that meant exactly. No one had ever enforced it before, but Karen was determined to set a precedent in Mark's gnome. Well, it was about to become her battleground. Mark didn't see the warning signs at first. One day, Karen showed up on his doorstep with a polite but firm letter. She asked him to remove the gnome because it violated the HOA rules. Mark, always the gentleman, smiled and nodded. No problem, he said. I'll look into it. But the letter was only the beginning. Within days, the polite note turned into a formal notice. Karen cited vague community standards and warned Mark that failure to comply could result in fines. Mark's neighbor, Susan, stopped by to warn him. You know, Karen doesn't mess around. She's been on the HOA board for years. If she wants you to take down that gnome, she'll make your life miserable. Mark chuckled. A garden gnome, it's just a silly statue. I'm not worried. That was his first mistake, because Karen didn't stop there. The next time Mark checked his mailbox, he found a thick envelope stamped with the HOAS official seal. Inside was a letter from a lawyer, the HOAS lawyer, demanding immediate removal of the gnome or legal action would follow. Mark's calm exterior cracked for a moment. He had spent years in courtrooms, but this wasn't a courtroom he expected to be back in. Not for something so trivial. Not in his retirement. He called his daughter Emily. Dad, you've got to fight this, she said. You can't let them bully you over a lawn ornament. Mark took a deep breath. He dusted off his old law books and started digging into the HOA's bylaws. The more he read, the more he realized how vague and unenforceable the rules really were. Still, the question lingered. Why was Karen so obsessed with this gnome? What was driving her to escalate this to a lawsuit? That's when the neighborhood started whispering. Did you hear? Karen's going after Mark over his gnome, said one neighbor, shaking her head. She's got nothing better to do. Karen's on a power trip. Another said, I'd watch my back if I were you. Mark's quiet dream of retirement was turning into a neighborhood spectacle, and this was only the beginning, because Karen wasn't just going to stop at letters or warnings. She was gearing up to sue. And Mark? He was about to find himself in the middle of the most ridiculous legal battle of his life. Pause. Then narrator lowers voice. What started as a simple decoration soon became a symbol of defiance, a challenge to authority, and a test of who really held power in the community. Mark never expected his retirement to end like this, but if you think the story ends with a garden gnome and a letter, think again. Karen's first letter had been just a polite request. Please remove your garden ornament, it read, as it does not comply with our HOA guidelines. Mark had almost tossed it in the trash, assuming it was just some minor misunderstanding. After all, the gnome had been there for years without complaint. But Karen was not the type to let something go quietly. When Mark didn't respond immediately, another letter arrived. This one was more formal, typed on official HOA letterhead, with legal jargon sprinkled throughout like a fog of intimidation. The tone had shifted from polite to stern. Mark was now being warned of potential fines and community rule enforcement. Mark's calm was beginning to crack. He called his daughter Emily again, his voice low with concern. Emily, they're serious about this. They're threatening fines now. Dad, Emily said, don't let them bully you, but maybe respond. Keep it civil. Ask them for exact rule citations. They probably don't even have a solid case. Mark agreed. He drafted a polite letter. He asked Karen and the HOA board to specify exactly which rule his gnome violated and how. He also reminded them the gnome had been there without incident for years. Days passed, no response, but Karen was not done. Then came the phone calls from the HOA board. From Karen herself, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late in the evening. You need to comply, she said, voice sharp and unyielding. This isn't a request. Mark tried to keep his cool, but the mounting pressure was beginning to wear on him. He was a retired lawyer, He knew how these things could spiral. He'd seen neighbors dragged into legal battles over far less. He suspected Karen was trying to send a message, maybe to him, maybe to the whole neighborhood. The neighbors noticed too. Rumors spread like wildfire. At the next HOA meeting, tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen stood at the podium, eyes scanning the room like a general rallying troops. "We need to uphold our community standards," she said, voice loud and resolute. "If we allow these decorations, what's next? Flamingos. Giant inflatable Santas." Some neighbors nodded in agreement. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Mark sat quietly, clutching his notes. He didn't want a war, but he wasn't going to back down either. Then Karen dropped the bombshell. "We're pursuing legal action," she announced, voice booming. "This case will set a precedent for all future enforcement. We will not be bullied by one homeowner's disregard for our rules." A hush fell over the room. Mark's heart sank. Legal action. This was no longer just a neighborhood disagreement. This was war. After the meeting, Mark's phone buzzed nonstop. Calls, texts, emails, some supportive, some warning him to back down, others curious about how far Karen would go. He remembered something his old mentor once told him: in any fight, know your opponent, and don't show your hand too soon. Mark decided to keep one thing secret. At first, he simply replied with polite but firm responses, refusing to escalate the conflict unnecessarily. But inside, he was preparing. He reviewed the HOA's bylaws, the state laws on homeowners associations, and his own records. The rules were vague, full of loopholes and ambiguous language, exactly the kind of thing Mark had spent his career navigating in court. He also quietly reached out to a few trusted friends, former colleagues from his law practice. He wasn't about to face this battle alone. Meanwhile, Karen ramped up the pressure. Her emails grew more aggressive. The HOA board passed resolutions backing her. Fines were levied. Notices threatened liens on Mark's property. Mark's calm exterior started to crack. He realized this wasn't about a garden gnome anymore. It was about power, control, and Karen's need to prove she was in charge. But Mark had a secret weapon. Karen didn't suspect. Something that would flip this entire battle on its head. He just hadn't revealed it yet. Pause for effect. "You see?" Karen thought Mark was just another homeowner, a grumpy old man who wouldn't fight back. But Mark wasn't just any homeowner. He was a retired trial lawyer, and he was ready. But before he revealed that the HOA was about to take their fight to the next level, Karen filed the lawsuit. Mark received the papers on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when you expect birds to be singing, not your mailbox to bring news of a legal battle. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside, the lawsuit demanded removal of the gnome, payment of fines, and court costs. It was real, and the war had officially begun. The lawsuit arrived on Mark's doorstep like a thunderclap on a perfectly calm day. It was real, it was official, and it was about a garden gnome. For most people, this would have been absurd, ridiculous even. But for Karen, the HOA president, with a mission. It was a crusade to prove that no one would break the rules on her watch. Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the thick envelope in his hands. The pages inside detailed claims about community standards violations, unauthorized lawn decorations, and willful disregard of HOA rules. The HOA demanded the gnome's immediate removal, along with hefty fines and legal fees. Mark let out a slow breath. "Well, Karen," he muttered, "you've officially made this personal." Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors took sides, and soon the once peaceful streets of Willow Creek were buzzing with whispers, gossip, and tension thick enough to choke on. Some saw Karen as the neighborhood hero, the one who dared to stand up and enforce order. Others saw her as a petty tyrant, wielding her power to make a simple man's life miserable. Mark, meanwhile, kept his composure, at least outwardly. Inside, he was quietly preparing for a fight. He reached out to old friends from his law practice, colleagues who owed him favors. Together, they started reviewing every page of the HOA's rules, searching for loopholes, technicalities, anything that could save the gnome and Mark's peace of mind. But the deeper Mark dug, the more he realized how vague and contradictory the HOA's rules really were. The no unauthorized decorations clause was never clearly defined. There was no procedure for warnings or negotiations. And strangely enough, several other neighbors had similar lawn ornaments, none of which had ever faced scrutiny. It was clear Karen was targeting Mark and his gnome specifically. Meanwhile, Karen was preparing her own arsenal. She gathered support from the HOA board, secured the backing of the HOA's lawyer, and started rallying neighbors to her cause. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Took the floor, her voice steady but forceful. "This is about protecting our community," she declared. "If we allow this violation to stand, what message are we sending? That anyone can ignore the rules. That we don't care about our neighborhood's standards." Some neighbors nodded vigorously. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mark listened quietly from the back, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a garden gnome anymore. It was about respect, authority, and who would control Willow Creek. When it was, His turn to speak, Mark stood slowly and addressed the crowd. Neighbors, I understand the importance of community standards, he began, but this lawsuit is based on vague, unenforceable rules. It's not about the gnome, it's about power and control. And I won't let fear or intimidation decide my rights. A murmur rippled through the room. Some whispered agreement, others disapproval. Karen's eyes narrowed. She was used to having the last word, but Mark was different. Calm, confident, experienced. After the meeting, the neighborhood's chatter intensified. Social media groups lit up with debates and memes, some jokingly dubbing it the gnome war. Mark's mailbox filled with letters of support and warnings. Some neighbors encouraged him to settle, others to stand firm. But Karen wasn't finished. Within days, she and the HOA lawyer filed a motion for court injunction demanding the immediate removal of the gnome before the case could even be heard. Mark's heart pounded as he prepared for the first court hearing. He knew this was just the beginning. But what Karen didn't know, what no one suspected, was that Mark had a secret weapon. You see, Mark was no ordinary retiree. He had spent his career in the courtroom, not just as a lawyer, but as a fierce litigator with decades of experience. He knew every trick, every loophole, every nuance of the law, and he was ready to use that knowledge to defend not just his gnome, but his rights as a homeowner. The day of the first court appearance arrived, and the Willow Creek community was buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread. The retired homeowner was about to face off against the overzealous HOA president in court. Would the gnome survive? Would Mark fold under pressure? Or was something else about to unfold? Mark arrived at the courthouse early, carrying only a simple folder with carefully organized documents and a quiet confidence. This wasn't his first rodeo, far from it. Over 4 decades, he'd argued cases in courts from small town halls to big city courts. But this was personal. Karen, meanwhile, marched into the courtroom with the determined air of a champion. Her supporters sat behind her, notebooks and phones in hand, ready to document every word. Karen's goal was clear: remove the gnome and send a message, no exceptions. As the judge called the case, the room fell silent. The tension was palpable. Karen's attorney stood first, presenting the HOA's case with sharp words and carefully selected phrases. The defendant has willfully violated the community's rules by maintaining an unauthorized lawn ornament, the lawyer said. Such behavior threatens the uniformity and standards the HOA is tasked with enforcing. Mark listened patiently, nodding occasionally, weighing every argument. When it was his turn, Mark rose calmly. His voice was clear, steady, and respectful. Your Honor, he began, I am here not to defy community standards, but to uphold fairness and clarity in the application of those standards. He laid out his points carefully, showing that the HOA's rules were vague, unenforceable, and selectively enforced. He highlighted how other neighbors had similar decorations without issue, evidence that the HOA was targeting him unfairly. The courtroom was quiet as Mark spoke. His calm demeanor and clear logic surprised many, including Karen's attorney. But then, just as Mark was about to finish, he dropped a line that made the courtroom shift, a detail Karen had never expected to hear. Your Honor, I am a retired trial lawyer with over 40 years of experience. I have defended clients, prosecuted cases, and navigated the complexities of the law. This isn't my first courtroom battle, and I intend to defend my rights vigorously. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Karen's confident expression faltered. For a moment, the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Suddenly, this case was no longer a simple HOA dispute. Mark's revelation changed everything. Karen's lawyer attempted to regain control, but the momentum had shifted. The judge asked for both parties to submit detailed evidence and set a date for the next hearing. As the courtroom emptied, Karen's supporters whispered nervously. Some avoided Mark's eyes. The atmosphere was no longer so sure, no longer so certain Karen would win this fight. Icily outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, neighbors who wanted to hear how this bizarre gnome lawsuit was unfolding. Cameras flashed as Mark stepped forward, maintaining his composed, dignified presence. Mr. Thompson, a reporter asked, do you think you can win against the H? Mark smiled quietly. I don't plan to lose back in the neighborhood. Reactions were mixed. Some praised Mark's poise and experience, admiring how he stood up for himself. Others whispered that he was making things worse, that the legal battle would drag on for months, maybe years. Karen, meanwhile, was in damage control mode. She called an emergency HOA meeting to reassure members that the fight was far from over. But privately, Karen was unsettled. She had underestimated her opponent. Mark's calm, experienced approach threw her off balance. He wasn't the easy target she'd hoped for. That night, Mark sat on his porch, gazing at the garden gnome glowing softly in the twilight. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Legal battles were draining, costly, and emotionally taxing. But he also knew something. Crucial knowledge was power. And in this fight, Mark had both. After the courtroom showdown, Mark returned home with a clear sense of purpose. The first hearing was over, but the real battle was only just beginning. The neighborhood was abuzz with speculation. Everyone wanted to know, what was Mark's next move, and how far would Karen go? For Karen, there was no question. She was determined to win, no matter what it took. Her drive to enforce the rules and prove her authority had only grown stronger, but she hadn't counted on Mark's legal expertise, or the way he quietly rallied support behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, Mark had been quietly gathering evidence. He'd spent late nights combing through the HOA's bylaws, the state's laws governing homeowner associations, and records from the community meetings. What he found surprised him. The HOA's own rules were riddled with inconsistencies, vague language, and procedural missteps. One critical discovery stood out. The HOA had never followed proper procedures for notifying homeowners about changes in the rules. Several amendments that Karen cited as justification for her case had not been properly approved or communicated. That meant those rules might not be enforceable at all. Mark also learned that several neighbors had flamingos, statues, birdbaths, and none had been challenged or fined. He quietly interviewed a few of them, gathering statements and photos as evidence of inconsistent enforcement. Mark's confidence grew, but so did Karen's aggression. The HOA board, emboldened by Karen's leadership, doubled down. They sent more threatening letters and increased the fines, pushing Mark's frustration to a boiling point. Then came the surprise. Late one evening, Mark received a call from an unexpected ally, Linda, a longtime HOA board member who had begun to question Karen's methods. "Mark, I can't stay silent anymore," Linda said in a hushed voice. "Karen's taken this too far. The way she's pushing this lawsuit is tearing the neighborhood apart. I've seen the documents you've uncovered, and you're right. There are problems with how they've handled this." Linda offered to provide internal HOA emails and meeting minutes that could prove the board's negligence in enforcing the rules fairly. Mark realized that this wasn't just about the gnome anymore. It was about exposing the truth about fairness, transparency, and the abuse of power. Meanwhile, Karen sensed cracks forming in her once solid base of support. Some neighbors were quietly withdrawing their backing, uneasy about the lawsuit's escalating costs and divisive impact. At the next HOA meeting, tensions reached a boiling point. Karen stormed into the room, ready for a battle, but she was met with resistance. Several board members, including Linda, challenged her aggressive tactics, questioning the wisdom of pursuing the lawsuit at such a cost. Voices rose. Accusations flew. The meeting devolved into chaos. Mark watched from the sidelines, knowing this internal conflict could shift the entire power dynamic, but Karen wasn't ready to concede. She doubled down, insisting the gnome must go. Then, the unexpected happened. At the height of the chaos, the HOA attorney sent a formal notice to the court, a motion to withdraw the lawsuit. The HOA board was reconsidering the legal fight. Mark's phone buzzed with news. The battle might be turning in his favor, but Karen wasn't finished. The motion to withdraw was quickly followed by a private letter from Karen herself, a warning, wrapped in a threat. "If you think this is over," she wrote, "think again. I will fight this until my last breath." Mark smiled quietly. The battle had taken a new turn. He realized this was a war of wills, one that could last much longer than anyone expected. Pause. Narrator lowers voice. Mark's secret weapon wasn't just his legal knowledge, it was his patience, his determination, and his unwavering commitment to fairness. And in the next chapter, things will get even more intense. What will Karen do when she realizes Mark isn't backing down? How far will she push this fight? And what surprise twist will change the game forever? After the HOA's surprising move to withdraw the lawsuit, the tension in Willow Creek didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew. Mark knew better than to think the battle was over just because Karen sent a threatening letter, promising to fight. Until her last breath, this was a war of wills, and neither side was ready to surrender. What Mark didn't expect was to find an unexpected ally from the most unlikely source, the HOA president's own family. One afternoon, Mark received a carefully worded email from Karen's sister, Lisa. She explained that she had been following the saga closely, and she wasn't pleased. "Karen's obsession with this gnome has gone beyond reason," Lisa wrote. "She's putting her own pride ahead of what's best for the community. I wanted to reach out before things got worse." Lisa's message was cautious but sincere. She even offered to meet with Mark in person, away from prying eyes and the gossip of the neighborhood. Mark agreed. They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Lisa was nervous but determined to help. "She doesn't realize how much damage this fight is causing," Lisa said, stirring her coffee. "Neighbors are divided, friendships are frayed, and the HOA board is crumbling." Mark listened carefully. This was valuable information, insider perspective that no legal documents could provide. Lisa admitted she had tried to talk some sense into Karen, but Karen was too invested. "She thinks this is about maintaining order," Lisa said. "But really, it's about control. She doesn't want to lose." Mark realized the personal nature of this feud was deeper than just HOA rules. It was about pride, power, and personal validation. As they parted ways, Lisa gave Mark a tip. Karen was considering escalating the fight in a way no one expected. She hinted that Karen was planning to push for a neighborhood vote to change the HOA rules that would give her even more power to enforce arbitrary standards and silence dissent. Mark knew this could be disastrous if it happened, but he had a plan. He began rallying the neighbors quietly, respectfully, but with growing momentum. He shared his findings about the HOA's rule changes, inconsistencies, and failures to follow procedure. He encouraged people to ask questions, to demand transparency, and to protect their rights. The community was divided, but slowly, more and more residents began to see the bigger picture. Karen, sensing the shift, pushed even harder. She called an emergency HOA meeting to propose the new rule changes designed to solidify her authority and prevent homeowners like Mark from challenging her. The meeting was packed. Voices clashed. Accusations flew. Emotions ran high. Mark spoke calmly, presenting his case with the clear, logical arguments that had made him a respected lawyer. He urged the homeowners to consider the long-term consequences, the erosion of their rights, the dangerous precedent that unchecked HOA power could set. Some neighbors were swayed by Karen's promises of order and uniformity. Others were moved by Mark's call for fairness and community spirit. The vote was tense, but when the ballots were counted, the results shocked. Everyone thought the proposed rule changes were defeated. Karen's power grab had failed, but the fight wasn't over. Karen's face tightened with frustration and something darker, resentment. As the meeting adjourned, she approached Mark. Her voice was low but icy. "This isn't the end," she warned. "You think you've won, but I have ways to make sure you regret this." Mark met her gaze calmly. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Pause. Narrator lowers voice for suspense. What Karen planned next would shake Willow Creek to its core, and it would force Mark to reveal a truth even more surprising than his legal background. The battle over a simple garden gnome had become a fight for the soul of the neighborhood. But who would come out on top? Karen's warning echoed through Mark's mind like a dark thunderclap. "You think you've won, but I have ways to make sure you regret this." What exactly did she mean? Mark had no idea, but he knew one thing for sure. Karen was a force of nature, unpredictable, relentless, and dangerous when cornered. Days passed. The neighborhood held its breath. Then, without warning, Karen made her move. Late one evening, Mark received a sharply worded letter, not from the HOA board, not from the attorney, but directly from Karen herself. The letter was thinly veiled, with threats, accusations, and vehemence that shocked even Mark. She accused him of undermining community harmony, sowing division, and disrespecting the HOA's authority. She demanded he remove the gnome immediately or face escalated legal action. Mark's smile was wry. He had seen this kind of posturing before. But what came next stunned the entire neighborhood. The very next day, Karen escalated by organizing a special HOA meeting, one that was meant to be a quiet gathering, but quickly turned into a spectacle. Word spread, and the meeting room was packed beyond capacity. Karen began with a fiery speech, rallying her supporters, painting Mark as a troublemaker, a man who refused to respect community rules and harmony. But then, as if on cue, Mark rose. His calm presence immediately shifted the room's energy. He didn't just defend his gnome. No, he revealed something far more powerful. Mark disclosed that he had been secretly recording several HOA meetings where Karen and her closest allies had admitted they were targeting him personally, bending rules, and ignoring proper procedures just to get rid of his garden ornament. Gasps filled the room. Mark laid out the recordings, transcripts, and evidence with the precision of a seasoned trial lawyer. He showed how Karen had repeatedly violated not just HOA rules, but basic principles of fairness and due process. Neighbors who had once supported Karen started exchanging uneasy glances. Mark then dropped the real bombshell. He revealed that war wasn't just about the gnome, it was about control, power, and her desire to dominate the neighborhood at any cost. The room was silent. Karen's face went pale, her usual confidence slipping. The tide had turned. Suddenly, the battle lines were clear. It wasn't about lawn decorations anymore. It was about trust, integrity, and community. With mounting pressure, the HOA board began to distance themselves from Karen. Several members quietly resigned, unwilling to be part of the ongoing conflict. Mark, for the first time in months, felt a cautious sense of hope, but the final chapter wasn't written yet. In the days that followed, Karen disappeared from the neighborhood's social gatherings, her once vocal presence replaced by silence and rumors. The HOA board called an emergency session to address the fallout. Mark was invited to attend as a guest, a sign that the community was ready to heal. At the meeting, the board formally apologized for the mishandling of the situation, withdrew all fines, and voted to revise the HOA's rules with clear, transparent processes for enforcement and homeowner input. Mark's gnome. It stayed bright, bold, and unmovable, just like its owner. Narrator voice softens. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Peace returned to Willow Creek. But Mark's story wasn't just about a garden gnome, it was about standing up not just for yourself, but for fairness and community. Pause, and about how sometimes the quietest neighbors can be the fiercest warriors. But wait, there's one last twist. Late one evening, after the dust had settled, Mark received a mysterious envelope. Inside was a note from Karen. It read simply, "You won this battle. but the war for Willow Creek's soul is far from over. Watch your back. Mark smiled. The dust had finally settled over Willow Creek. The gnome still stood proudly on Mark's lawn, a silent symbol of resilience, justice, and the messy, complicated fight that had rocked a quiet neighborhood. For Mark, the battle had been more than just about a garden decoration. It had become a test of character, a lesson in standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board worked diligently to rebuild trust. They rewrote the community rules, making sure they were clear, fair, and properly communicated. Homeowners finally had a voice, a place to be heard without fear of retaliation. Neighbors who had once taken sides began to reconnect. Friendships that had frayed were slowly mended over backyard barbecues and block parties. Mark found himself invited to neighborhood gatherings more often. No longer just the guy with the gnome, but a respected member of the community. But the story didn't end there. One afternoon, as Mark was tending to his garden, he noticed something unusual. A small package had been left on his doorstep. No note, no name. Curious, Mark opened it carefully. Inside was a brand new garden ornament, a whimsical little gnome, but this one was holding a tiny legal briefcase. A note was attached, written in an elegant, familiar handwriting. Keep fighting the good fight. An unexpected friend. Mark smiled. Was it from Lisa, a reconciled neighbor, or someone else entirely? He didn't know, but the message was clear. The fight for fairness, respect, and community spirit was far from over. Pause. Narrator lowers voice for dramatic effect. Mark reflected on the journey, the ridiculous lawsuit, the neighborhood division, the courtroom drama, and the personal battles behind the scenes. He realized that sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest changes, and that standing up for yourself, even against seemingly impossible odds, can inspire a whole community to do the same. As Mark looked out at his lawn, his eyes resting on the original gnome, standing tall, he felt a quiet pride. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who believed that communities should be built on respect, fairness, and understanding, not fear and control. Narrator voice softens, becomes more personal. If there's one thing Mark wants you to take away from this story, it's this. Don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in. Know your rights, speak your truth, and never underestimate the power of patience, preparation, and calm determination. And sometimes, a garden gnome isn't just a garden gnome, it's a symbol of fighting back. Pause. Before we close this chapter, a quick reminder. If you enjoyed this story, the drama, the humor, the twists, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share with anyone who's ever had a neighborhood battle of their own. And if you want to hear more stories like this, true tales of everyday heroes standing up in surprising ways, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your experiences. Narrator voice lowers for the final suspenseful twist, but here's the real kicker. Weeks after the dust settled, Mark got a call from an unexpected source, the HOA's former attorney she wanted to meet. She revealed next. Well, that's a story for another day. Pause for now. The garden gnome stands a quiet reminder that sometimes the biggest battles come from the smallest places. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned.